So I'm going to start by reading to you this passage from this lovely text that has been really one of the more important texts since I encountered Tibetan Buddhism Vajrayana back in 2000, actually. And it's a book called Introduction to Tantra, A Vision of Totality by Lama Yeshe. It's a lovely book. He was just an amazing teacher and had some great translators who really caught the essence of his teachings. He unfortunately passed away in, I think, 1983, long before I ever knew anything about Dharma. Otherwise, I would have sought him out and considered him a root teacher, most likely. So anyway, Lama Yeshe here talks about kind of the view of renunciation when it comes to pleasure. When it comes to pleasure. And a little bit before this passage, he talks about kind of our misperceptions of Buddhism that we can have around things like pleasure, and tries to kind of give us the sense, anyway, of how to approach sense pleasures or sensual pleasures. Not just sexual pleasure, but anything that's driven by appetite or craving. So Lama Yeshe tells us, renunciation does not mean we should give up our pleasures. Far from it. The whole philosophy of Buddhism in general, and of Tantra in particular, is that as human beings with virtually unlimited potential, we should aim for the highest pleasure possible. What true renunciation is based on is the realization that our ordinary pleasures are dissatisfying. They are, after all, fairly inconsequential when compared with the extraordinary bliss to be had from awakening the energies latent within us and fulfilling our deepest potential. Not only are these ordinary pleasures unsatisfactory, but our grasping at them prevents us from experiencing the superior happiness of full self-realization. Our grasping, squeezing attitude is an intoxicant that dulls our natural clarity. We become more and more deeply enmeshed in the world of ordinary appearances and more removed from our essential nature. To develop renunciation, therefore, means to realize how our ordinary appearances, how our ordinary reliance on pleasure is preventing us from tasting this higher, more complete form of happiness. So it's interesting to me how these 5 precepts we've been looking at, this is our 3rd week, were not introduced to the community by the Buddha for 12 years. So they actually came, they were instituted by the Buddha 12 years into this formation of the early Buddhist community, which is interesting because what it says to me is that there were clearly issues in the early Sangha, yeah, that there were perhaps some confusions around conduct, and that there was a need for this early monastic community to sort of put these in place. So as we've seen, the first one of non-harming and how it pertains to also to meet and the approach to others, as well as to interhuman conflict, violence, as well as harming animals, vegetarianism versus eating meat, that these were issues even then that were very much alive. And then the second one, non-stealing or not taking what is not freely given. that we did last week. And here, on this third precept, these restraints, or there seem to be restraints, are actually not meant to be these harsh kind of judgments about anyone who engages in overindulgence in sense pleasures or these things. But rather, it is a way to keep one on the path, to keep one tethered on the path in such a way that their practice and their mind remains in very wholesome states. Yeah. After all, we're talking about largely cause and effect. This quality of what we do sets up a pattern within our own consciousness. So, really being mindful of the patterns that we put our energy into. Here, it's part of right effort in Buddhism and the Eightfold Path. And it's not just a moral thing. It's not, in fact, it didn't start out as this kind of morality play, but really it's about cause and effect and what kinds of states are we cultivating. Well, so if we consider these precepts as having been originated in a community environment, two monastics who are mostly male and observed and encouraged by other male monastics. We have this kind of this language, if you will, this voice that can feel very, very kind of paternalistic in some cases. And we see this evolve even more as Buddhism encounters other cultural influences, as it spreads to other parts of Asia. How the cultural priorities actually begin to inform and even put words in the Buddha's mouth that he never said. Now, what did he say? What is it for monastics? Basically, all monastics are meant to be celibate. No question there. That if you're a monk or a nun, that you do not engage in any form of sexual activity of any kind. Yeah? But for lay people, and I'm looking, I don't think there are any monastics here on our call tonight, but for the rest of us who are lay people, how these precepts are applied, take into account, are meant to take into account that we will engage in love making and in sensual pleasures, in eating, in enjoying nice things. Yeah. And so these precepts for Buddhism to apply, for Dharma to apply to the wider community, it was so important to really make these relevant. So what we're talking about here is this third precept applied to lay followers, since monastics are, again, meant to be celibate. Now that too changes over time, where if you're perhaps a monk, a lama in Tibet somewhere, you may be married and have children. You're probably not living in a monastic environment at that time. But you do see the import, I guess, of people who do end up having families and kind of moving to the West, as Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche, one of the early, so he's the early founder of Shambhala Buddhism, married a Western woman, had kids. His son is now, or has been, the lineage holder of Shambhala, but he got kind of caught up in some scandals. So you can see these are human problems that are just baked into being a human being. So there are four things from the Pali Canon that we can reliably say the Buddha taught that this constitutes basically irresponsible habits around sexuality. And so what is it that he's saying constitutes sexual misconduct? The first one is coerce, not to coerce someone into any kind of sexual activity. That is a breaking of that precept. And you can be expunged, you can be expelled from the community even as a lay follower. So no coercion. Um, not no sexual activity with someone who is underage. So this was important. And largely how it's expressed in the canon is someone who is under the guardianship of parents, of family, of relatives. This is often taken to mean somebody who is what we would now call a minor. Yeah. So this was important as well. Now, what age is not specified. And we also know that in that part of, at that time period and in that part of northern India, what is now southern Nepal, people got married. There's a whole sort of system of marrying off daughters at younger ages than we're probably used to. So, but the point is that this was an issue, and it was important to the Buddha as well. The third is not to engage in sexual activity with someone who is either married or is engaged to someone else. So, what we would call adultery is prohibited here. You know? And then the fourth is not to cause a monastic to break their vow of celibacy. So you can't seduce a monk or a nun. That is not okay. You're breaking the precept. If you're causing them to break this vow of celibacy. And basically, there are a few other elements that we see in the Pali Canon, such as an overindulgence or an obsessiveness around anything having to do with the sense pleasures. So it's not just sexual activity, but it could be just gluttony, needing to eat a lot of food was sort of in this category as well. And so you can see here how all of these things are hindrances to cultivating a really wholesome habit on the path, wholesome conduct. Now, these are seen as negative qualities if we break these precepts. But the point isn't that a person is bad or evil necessarily, but rather it's lifting up the wholesome qualities. It's trying to sort of shine a spotlight on contentment, on the cultivation of being content with your partner. Yeah. What's called joyful satisfaction, a sense of well-being, and for us to monitor our expectations of others. So it's interesting, there may have been differences among the lay community in relationships that were constantly problems between partners, perhaps between probably married folks, although the Buddha never says you must be married in order to make love. Yeah, he never says that. So it's for the cultivation of contentment. Now, for a lot of us, so I am divorced. Yeah, my marriage didn't work out after 23 years. It was very difficult, and yet I supported it. I supported my spouse, who really just wanted to change her life, and after all that time, we'd grown up in the relationship, and it was not contentious at all. And so I think, for lay people in modern times, part of that contentment also means supporting the needs and the well-being of the other person too. It can be hard, right? I mean, for me, it was very difficult. I really had to grieve the loss of this best friend, partner, what felt like soulmate all those years. And yet I also knew it was important for her well-being that I relinquish all of those expectations. And so I was the one eventually who moved out, just to really sort of facilitate that freedom for both of us. So the point I'm making here is that there may be good reason to separate, to maybe not be content or not feel like our needs are being met. All good. Yeah, we shouldn't stay in relationships that are dysfunctional or where we're just not happy. If it's time to go, it's time to go. But I don't think this was necessarily the heart of what the Buddha was trying to teach us. Be content with someone that you're miserable with. I don't think that was the spirit of it. But rather, turn the lens inward and look at those expectations that we place on other people. After all, as my teacher Leslie used to tell us, sometimes when we fall in love, that first blush of infatuation and passion, what is happening there? Well, we are projecting heaven onto that other person. Has anybody ever felt this? No? Ruth is shaking her head. Is this person the source of our heaven? It feels like it. And what Leslie used to tell us is, look, you're feeling that experience because it's already alive inside of you. You're just awakening it and throwing it onto that person and coming up with a whole narrative about it and about them. And it feels pretty good when it's mutual, right? For a while. Now that doesn't mean it doesn't blossom into a deeper, abiding, enduring partnership and loving relationship where you mature together and all of that. So definitely not cynical about that at all. But I think the point here is that these quote-unquote prohibitions that we find in the Anguttara Nikaya, this is the text where we can find in the Pali Canon where the Buddha teaches these elements of sexual misconduct, what not to engage in, where we can find these things. Now it's interesting. So there is a word in the text that is pandaka, Pandaka, pandaka. And there's been some kind of debate about what this means. Scholars generally translate this term to mean just any individual who has broken the precept of sexual misconduct. Other scholars have said that it's a person who is outside the realm of the normative, quote unquote, male-female gendered binary relationship. After all, at that time, there are references to men wearing women's clothing and women wearing men's clothing, where they identified with the other gender. And this was a case even then in India. So this has been around a long. It's so natural. It's been around a long time. And so some scholars have said that this term may refer to them, which is an entirely different meaning than breaking the precepts. It doesn't assume that someone who is transgendered is breaking any of the precepts. It's just a matter of how is this term translated? What is it referring to? Because we really aren't sure. Scholars aren't sure, and they debate these things even now. There's also no mention of homosexuality at all. So some lineages, some traditions talk about that the Buddha said homosexuality is wrong. Well, it's not in the original Pali Canon. We start seeing those again later during certain contexts where people start commenting on the Buddha's teachings. And one of those traditions, and mind you, I'm not knocking the tradition, but my own sort of home, if you will, in Vajrayana Buddhism also comes with some of these culturally laden beliefs that are quite paternalistic. And also, in particular, how they see women's bodies as opposed to the male body. The great Tsongkhapa, who was the Kagyu master around the 14th century in Tibet, who basically developed the Lamrim teachings, the graduated path, wrote the great treatise on the path to enlightenment. This is a master that just is revered by Kagyu Tibetan Buddhists in Vajrayana ever since. Great master, great teachings. And he had some things to say about women's bodies, and that kind of imply this cultural context that I was talking about. So what are some of those things that we see? And this isn't, by the way, just Tsongkhapa. We can see this in other lineages as they unfolded. And texts were written, commentaries were made. So later, what we start seeing is that things like homosexuality, or what we would probably anything falling under the LGBTQIA plus umbrella, is seen to be that which will send you to a hell realm. In other words, you'll go to hell if you do this. Right? Now, the Buddha talked about hell realms, and it's these sort of realms where, due to very, very unwholesome karma and unwholesome deeds in this lifetime, that we end up in this kind of hellish realm that is self-created. Now, a lot of people will talk about this hell realm as a psychological states. Basically, we're so ensnared in samsara and in craving and clinging and doing things that lead to even deeper tendencies that it really is like being in a hell realm. Some of the moralistic tones that we see almost reverberate some of the evangelical other traditions that are evangelical in nature, about going to hell if you are gay, or if you have this tendency or that, or things like oral sex, all of that. So we start seeing these restrictions and these things that say things like a man can have sex 5 times a night, but a woman can only make love once a week or once every 10 days. I think it's something like that. You start seeing these very distinct differences in priorities. Yeah, you can only make love at night, not during the daytime. This is a prohibition. No, and I don't know why. I don't have any idea why that would be the case. But no afternoon delight for any of us, apparently. I'm thinking of the song, by the way, in the 70s. We have to wait till it gets dark. No touching of body parts with the fingers. This is another one that this is also can send you to a hell realm. No oral sex. Nothing other than basically making love and procreating for children. That's it. Yeah. And therefore you must be married. So again, you see these in other traditions too. This is not specific to this sort of orthodox, sort of culturally informed Buddhism. And it's largely patriarchal. It's largely paternalistic in nature. After all, these were men, middle-aged men, sort of setting these codes down for lay followers. A place and time with a social, moral priority, and also issues that we've seen in other traditions that date back to the 2,000 years or more, around cleanliness, around responsible habits with the body. So anyway, we start seeing these discrepancies here between the early Buddhist teachings and things that then come later and are basically reiterating the Buddhist teachings, but adding many, many words into his mouth.